Welcome back to the podcast where we get cozy with the cosmos. If you're new here, my name is Sarah Bosch, and I am your host, astrologer, and coach. And if you've been around for a while with these episodes, thank you. It's so great to have you back. I've talked recently about ways that I'm reshaping this podcast, one of them being the new setup as we get cozy with our blanket and our candles. And the other things that I'm doing is I'm totally restructuring the rhythm and the format. So now you're going to get a new episode every Thursday, and it's going to alternate between lunar cycle astrology forecasts. We're going to do deep dives into astrology techniques or focus topics. And then I'm also going to offer once a month of full moon horoscopes and a tarot card pull for every rising sign. I'm super excited. This format, this rhythm really gets me lit up to kind of expand and do more things creatively and tap into different channels of talking about astrology. So this week is going to bring us to our first focus topic episode. And we're going to talk all about eclipses. Dun dun dun. We're going to talk about what they mean, how they've been understood differently across different astrological traditions, and how you can work with them in your chart. I'm also going to mention a few resources and link them below this episode for you to check out from some of my favorite astrologers that are doing incredible work with this focus topic on eclipses. And I recommend that you check those out if you're interested in learning more after this video. So let's just start from the top. What is an eclipse? One of my favorite terms that I recently heard astrologer Gemini Brett use is this idea of shadow play between the sun and the moon. I think even just that phrasing invites so much contemplation into what an eclipse is. But on a more technical level, an eclipse is a new moon or a full moon that occurs when there's an alignment between the sun, the moon, and the earth across the ecliptic at the point where we call the nodes, the north node and the south node. Maybe you've heard of those terms before. If you've heard of those or maybe read about those aren't actually planets or asteroids. The north node and south node are actual mathematical points that are these cross points in the ecliptic. And they denote when there is an alignment between the sun, the moon, and the earth during a new moon and full moon, where there will be a shadow cast over one of the lights or luminaries, casting its shadow, shall we say, and eclipsing the light of that luminary. So on a solar eclipse, this is always going to happen on a new moon. And this is when the alignment eclipses the light of the sun. Versus a lunar eclipse, this is always an eclipse occurring on the full moon, when the shadow is cast over the light of the moon, giving it a little reddish tint that we see when we look into the sky. So whether it's the moon blocking the sun's light in a solar eclipse, or it's the earth casting its shadow across the moon in a lunar eclipse, archetypally, both of these are hiding light. And that's where we get this idea and this concept of shadow play. Eclipses are not just random one-off events. Eclipses are always part of a much longer cosmic rhythm that we weave through time. First, we have eclipse seasons. So this happens every 6 months or so, when these little windows of time that the sun and the moon line up with the earth and the nodes, and the eclipses occur during the new moons and the full moons. So it always happens every 6 months, twice a year. It's usually in the same 2 signs. Sometimes there's a crossover when the nodes are shifting signs. And these eclipse cycles usually last about 18 months. So about 1.5 to 2 years, we'll see the same series of eclipses in the same signs. Then, on a bigger scale, eclipses belong to what's called a Saros cycle. This is an 18-year family of eclipses that repeat with a very similar pattern of the sun, moon, and earth and the geometry that they create. Each Saros family lasts over 1,000 years. So that means when the eclipse we experience today from the Saros family, it's actually part of a much older story that began centuries ago. So when we experience an eclipse, we are not just feeling today's energy. We're plugging into a larger cosmic inheritance that's been echoing through time. It's kind of fun to investigate. If you're somebody who likes to look and learn through the lens of your personal astrology, you can actually look up the eclipses that were happening right before you were born. This is called your prenatal eclipse. And then you can identify which eclipse family, so which Saros cycle those eclipses live within, And then you can track the cycle of those specific Saros cycle eclipses that happen throughout your lifetime and start to just maybe notice that there's a pattern of significance that's a little bit more heightened during those specific eclipses. So, taking into consideration this awareness that these eclipses are part of a much longer, larger cosmic story and unfolding, that means for us personally that an eclipse can feel like fate stepping in. It can be like a story long in the making, suddenly taking a turn. This is why eclipses often coincide with those big life redirecting moments that we couldn't have planned if we tried. And also the consideration that the effect of the eclipse does not just last 6 months like a typical new moon to full moon. Because it's a part of these larger cycles of time, the effects and the implications of what happens during an eclipse usually plays out for at least another year, sometimes 2 years later. And it can be even life-changing if it's an eclipse that's impacting our natal chart in a really sensitive and personal way. And part of that comes back to this shadow play and coming back to the idea that the light is being obscured or eclipsed during these new moons and full moons. Oftentimes, we don't see what the implications of that eclipse was until we look back in retrospect. Another key phrase that I like to use for eclipses before we dive into some more details is that when you think about solar eclipse, as you can think of the phrase major beginnings. And when you think about lunar eclipses or the full moon eclipses, you can think about major endings or completions. I notice that sometimes people get tripped up on the word completion. Sometimes completion means fruition. Think about how we talk about our full moons. Yes, sometimes that means things are coming to an end or a close, but it can also mean that things are coming to a point of release, of karmic kind of blossoming with that full moon, major endings. So, next, I want to talk about some of the meanings across different traditions. And what I'm talking about when I say astrological traditions, there's modern astrology, there's Vedic astrology, and then there's Hellenistic or traditional astrology. I personally practice traditional or Hellenistic astrology in my client practice. I do weave in some of the archetypal modern astrology as well into my work, but for the most part, when I'm using any kind of timing techniques, we're always using traditional astrology. So it's kind of fascinating to me to recognize that these different astrological traditions do look at and interpret eclipses differently. In modern astrology, there's more of this energy around growth and spiritual development. They see eclipses as being these catalysts for big releases and beginnings, the North Node as this point of soul growth and development. The South Node is kind of our karmic past or past lives, if you believe in that concept. Whereas the Vedic tradition, they actually call the North Node Rahu and the South Node Ketu. And the Vedic tradition in general is much more rooted in the karmic philosophy. So they really see the eclipses through the karmic lens and this sort of ripening of the individual's inherent karma that we see in the natal chart versus in traditional astrology where we're really looking at eclipses as potential amplifiers of the natal promise. So what is a natal promise? Have you ever heard that term before? Maybe you haven't. In traditional astrology, a natal promise is basically telling us that nothing's ever going to happen in an individual's life that isn't already promised in the natal chart. We should be able to identify everything in the birth chart of potentiality, of manifestation, of growth, of change, of beginnings and endings within the natal context. And if we don't see that in the natal chart, then an eclipse isn't really going to do much for that individual. Eclipses really are just stirring themes already present in the natal context. Archetypally, you can kind of imagine this as the natal chart having this locked treasure chest, right? And the eclipses might come and unlock that chest and force it open, and something might fly out. But what's going to fly out, whether it's something really exciting and good or something really tragic and hard, that's dependent on what was already in that chest, in that treasure chest. I hope that kind of helps clarify some of the differences between the traditions and how they work with or interpret the eclipses, and also gives you a little bit more understanding of what we mean when we say natal promise. And if you're somebody who's more interested in diving deep into this idea of natal promise and investigating what that means specifically for you, I just launched a new mentorship program with my colleague Alexandra Blair, specifically focused on this topic. It's called Living Chartwork, and it's a very limited space availability. We're limiting it to 12 individuals, and it's going to be a really hands-on immersion into learning these techniques through actually doing them and working together in collaboration and group and working through live chart demos. So if you're interested in learning more about that or seeing if you can enroll, then go ahead and check out that link below. And now I want to circle back to the North Node and South Node and the interpretations or meanings of those. Is this an eclipse happening with the North Node or the South Node? So the North Node and the South Node are always positioned in equal and opposite positions in the sky. So in equal polarity of the zodiac signs. For instance, right now we have the North Node in Pisces and we have the South Node in Virgo. Next, we will have the North Node in Aquarius and the South Node in Leo. And so I want to talk a little bit about the difference between a North Node eclipse and a South Node eclipse. Across both Vedic and Hellenistic astrology traditions, the North Node was seen as this point of increase, a point of obsession potentially, of hunger, especially of hunger for worldly things or material things. When we see a planet conjunct a North Node in a natal chart, sometimes we read that as the potential for that planet to have a little bit heightened power and potential for better or for worse, like a really hungry Mars, a little insatiable Mars, that could lead to a little bit of destruction and heightened amounts of conflict in that person's life. Versus the South Node in Vedic and Hellenistic traditions is seen more as this point of release, a point of transcendence, or a focus on more of the spiritual longings of the soul. So a shift of focus from worldly acquisition and prominence to spiritual acquisition and more of this idea of transcending worldly things. So now let's come back to that example we gave of Mars in the natal chart. If we had Mars conjunct the South Node this time instead of the North Node, this is going to give that Mars a weakening effect. We're going to have a diminishment of the Mars potential and that kind of fiery, ambitious, action-oriented Mars in the native's life. This might be somebody who's more conflict avoidant or somebody who struggles to gather their willpower and their energy to attain worldly ambitions and goals. This is somebody who's not really driven potentially by those worldly ambitions. So I hope that gives you a little bit more clear of a picture of that difference between the North Node and the South Node, and maybe a beginning application of how to put it into the birth chart or kind of start to put it with the planets and how that might impact the different expression of the planets in the native's life. And I also want to mention that in my own personal practice as an astrologer over the last decade, in my client work and my personal experience, I personally have not seen the truth of the idea in modern astrology that the North Node is a point that brings fruition for the future soul development of this idea of like it's taking us forward, it's growth, and the South Node being this point of our past lives. I really see both the North Node and the South Node participating and moving individuals forward in really significant and life-changing fated ways. So that's just my own personal experience. I'm curious, are you somebody who works with eclipses, works with the nodes? And what's been your experience? Go ahead and comment below. I'd love to hear what your experience has been. If it's different than mine, I'd love to learn from you. On that note, one thing I have seen and I will advocate for is that I do not encourage people to use eclipses as times to set intentions, to ritualize, to put things into motion, or put moon water or crystals outside. Eclipses are shadowy in nature. The light is being eclipsed. There's so much that we can't see during an eclipse. And I also know astrologers and colleagues that I respect the hell out of their work, and they don't believe that. So, of course, always take what's useful and discard the rest, and trust yourself over me or any other so-called astrology expert. And I don't mean to be all doom and gloom and fear-mongering when I say this. All I'm saying is that eclipses have their own energy and their own agenda. And I tend to see that whatever we put into motion or we think we're putting into motion, it's usually not how it's going to actually result or come out in the end. Because of those cycles of time that we talked about in the beginning that are connected to the eclipses, there's usually something bigger playing out that we don't even really know about. And there's also this very fated aspect Sometimes we can have plans and we're going in one direction, and then all of a sudden eclipses come through, and the waves of the ocean that have been coming through the tide at the same height every day, it's a tsunami that washes us all the way onto a different shore. I thought it might be fun and a little bit helpful to share a personal story since, that's what we're doing. We're getting cozy. We're talking about the cosmos. So I want to tell you about the moment that I became an astrologer. Dun da da, what do you know? It was an eclipse. I actually used to be a pharmacist. I practiced pharmacy in an orthopedic surgery hospital in Omaha, Nebraska. And in 2015, I was in my last year of pharmacy school. I was applying for residencies. I really planned to specialize and had this whole trajectory. I was very ambitious. I did all the right things. My grades were on point. I had great recommendations. And on the day of a Pisces eclipse, I got turned down from every single residency that I had applied for. My life had completely turned upside down. The relationship I was in ended unexpectedly, in hindsight, expectedly. And I felt like life had just shown up to my door, and I was holding this bucket with all of my life plans and all of the things I had done to get to where I'm going and where I'm going to go next. And it just took the bucket out of my hands as soon as I opened that door. It turned it upside down, poured everything onto the floor, and then gave me the bucket back, kind of laughed and winked at me and walked away. As you can imagine, I was totally distraught, and literally the only thing I could think to do was to read about the astrology of the moment. I was like, what is going on? Like, I did everything right. Everything was set in a very specific plan, in a very specific order, in case you didn't pick up on it. Yes, I am a Capricorn. And it didn't work out. So why? Like, what is going on? And I started reading about the eclipse, the Pisces eclipse that was happening. It was also what's called a nodal opposition for me personally. Maybe we'll do that in another video. I'm not going to go into that now. But it's a very potent window of time in everybody's lives where I call it the cosmic chiropractic adjustment, this nodal opposition, where if you're going down the wrong trajectory, life will kind of snap you back in place. And that can feel really destabilizing and frustrating, like it did for me in 2015. Or maybe you've been waiting for the moment to finally break free and get out of the path that you're on. It's all dependent on ourselves, our circumstances, our psychological makeup, our emotional makeup, our worldview, etc., etc. I digress. Anyways, all this to say that eclipse was nothing I planned. That moment in time that felt really significant for the reason I thought it was. I thought it meant that I wasn't supposed to do residency. I was just supposed to get a job locally, stay in Nebraska, work at this orthopedic surgery hospital. And in hindsight, that isn't even what it was about. It led me all the way to where I am today. And now we're at the other nodal opposition point, which is actually my nodal return. Again, another topic maybe for another day, but a significant window of time if you're tracking eclipses in your natal chart. And it's really exciting because I love where I'm at. I love this trajectory, but I never would have put myself on here if it weren't for the eclipses. And I guess that's what I mean by they're shadowy, they're faded. There's this invitation to kind of trust that something's happening for us that's aligned to what it is that we're intended to do, that natal promise that exists, that isn't really in our control, but it is in our favor in the long run. Again, it comes back to that like retrospect view that we sort of have. So let's talk a little bit about do's and don'ts during eclipses, right? These are my personal opinions. These are my personal practice. These are not something that you have to do if you're like not into it. You do you, babe. But for me, I always use eclipses as times to not force or try to manifest specific outcomes. I usually try to not put anything into motion or start anything major intentionally. And then I also don't ritualize the eclipse in terms of setting moon water or charging crystals. I avoid any of that. Also because our bodies are so intimately connected to the moon and the rhythms of the moon and the sun, I usually try to make sure during eclipse season that I'm always cushioning myself and my schedule with a lot of extra time for self-care. I am drinking more water, I am eating better foods, I am seeing less people, I am doing less in public. I'm a little bit cave mode during eclipses, right? Like I'm kind of not so much like taking cover as I am kind of getting myself out of the way to minimize the destabilization or the turbulence, shall we say, of the eclipse cycle. I'm also just highly, highly sensitive to the moon and eclipses. And so I notice if I don't do these practices, I can sometimes get sick, or there's been times where I got injured because I try to just keep doing the status quo of what I was doing. So for me, I'm like, okay, I need to just chill out. It's eclipse season. Nothing is chill right now. What can I do to make myself a little bit more chill? So my personal dues: extra self-care, extra water, extra rest, extra good, nourishing foods. I like to reflect. I like to observe. I like to journal more during eclipse seasons, kind of asking, what is it that this space is revealing? Are there shadows that are coming up? I'm really into pattern interruption, especially in my coaching work. And shadows tend to bring old patterns up in a really loud way. That doesn't mean that we're necessarily in the pattern or we're reliving or regressing into the pattern. It's almost as if the eclipse energy brings the pattern up in this heightened way for the opportunity to release it, interrupt it, or change it in a significant, dramatic way. Kind of like instead of needing to work through a pattern in therapy over 6 months, 12 months, 10 years, if we can wake up to the pattern in the moment of the eclipse cycle and we can change or interrupt it with a new pattern in that moment, it's like it does 10 plus years of change, of pattern change, and maybe even karmic resolution. And then, of course, to ask myself, what would it take to allow more space for fated change? What would it be like to trust that whatever is happening right now is trying to reveal something to me, is trying to take me somewhere that I might not be able to see in this moment? And along those lines of the pattern interruption or the karmic resolution, eclipses are a great time to do cutting work. If there's a change that you've been working on or a cord that you're trying to cut, an eclipse is a great time to cut that cord. Eclipses kind of have that Saturnian power in that way, where whatever we end or sever has a deeper severing power and perseverance. And whatever we hold on to, whatever we, grip or commit even deeper into, it can kind of solidify in that Saturnian way where it might take more time later to get ourselves out of it. And again, none of this is meant to be fear-mongering, but we are talking about eclipses and they're a little bit spooky, so don't blame me, blame the eclipses. And if my don'ts during eclipse season aren't obvious at this point, then I'll go ahead and make them obvious. Don't force anything. Don't try to manifest anything specific. If you've been putting in the work and you're on the right trajectory and you haven't been avoiding change that is obvious change that needs to happen, then eclipses aren't anything to fear. They aren't anything to be afraid of. There's something to be like, oh my God, yes, let's catch this wave and take me further, farther, faster. Unless you are avoiding change, then maybe there's a little bit of fear involved. My Sag moon, she might be coming in a little bit too hot with that one. Let's get back to it. One other thing that I wanted to mention in this episode was the idea of eclipses outside of the natal context. So not just you personally, but what about the collective or the mundane impact of eclipses? This is something that was really a focus, especially for the Hellenistic astrological tradition. This is really where they spent most of their time when working with eclipses or reading eclipses. So in ancient times, they feared that eclipses signified the death of rulers. It signified wars of major collective turbulence and destructive, life-changing events. What we can look for and you can pay attention to during the eclipse seasons, notice and look for any leadership changes on a collective level. You can also pay attention to any secrets that might be surfacing, especially through prominent figures in collective history and collective reality in today's society. This is that collective shadow play coming onto the stage. So it's kind of an interesting way to investigate the ideas that we've been talking about on this episode around eclipses. The solar eclipses, because we're eclipsing the light of the sun, and sun traditionally rules rulers, people in authority, leaders, people who have prominence and significance. When there's a solar eclipse, sometimes that can mean the eclipse of a leader, the fall of somebody in charge or in authority. You can kind of pay attention, whether it's your local collective, like your boss at work, or maybe it's the boss of the United States and America. We can all just kind of see like what's going to happen during that Virgo solar eclipse we've got next week in an exact opposition to Saturn. Ugh. versus the lunar eclipses, which were said to signify more of the mundane events for the everyday man, the everyday person. And so we can pay attention to maybe there's collectives of people that are being impacted by these eclipses. And it's just something to kind of, like I said, use for investigation purposes, a deeper investigation and observation. If you're somebody who wants to know more and you're not just going to take my word for it, it's really helpful. You can even look back historically at major events that happened to different leaders or even different groups of people and see if they track with any significant eclipses, especially eclipses that might be hitting or visible in that area of the world. So there's obviously so much that we could say about eclipses, and I am definitely not an eclipse expert when it comes to astrology. I do read and track eclipse cycles in my personal life and my personal chart work, and I always work with eclipses when I'm working with clients. But there are so many incredible astrologers out there that have done so much work and research, whether that's empirical research within their own client research or also just reading through all of these incredible astrologers throughout history and gathering all of this wisdom to share with you. Again, I'm going to link those resources for you below. If you found any of this interesting and you want to know more, I highly encourage you to check those astrologers out. And then bringing all of this back to our present moment reality. These eclipses that we are currently in. The first eclipse is going to be a total lunar eclipse, a full moon eclipse in Pisces on September 7th. And then the second eclipse of this cycle is going to be a new moon partial solar eclipse at 28 degrees of Virgo. I'm going to talk way more about these eclipses and some of the astrological significations impacting both of them individually in upcoming episodes. Remember, next week, I'm going to do that full moon rising sign horoscope for each rising sign. And I'm also going to do a tarot card pull. One thing you can start to think about before we get to those episodes is the houses that Pisces and Virgo rule in your chart. And what are the themes or the topics of those houses? And around those topics and themes of your Virgo Pisces houses, what are some things that feel hidden right now during this eclipse season? Is there something that's asking to be released around these topics and themes? And what treasure might be waiting? Eclipses remind us that light can disappear. But in that pause, in that shadowy space, something faded, karmic, or evolutionary can possibly break through. Whether you see eclipses as a growth edge, as a karmic lesson or reapening, or fate itself of a natal promise, eclipses are always invitations to step courageously and willingly into the next chapter. Thank you so much for joining me on Cozy with the Cosmos. I'm your host, Sarah Posh, and I hope that if you enjoyed this video, you will give it a like. Comment below if you enjoyed this content, this focus topic episode. If there's anything that you'd love to learn about on these focus topic deep dive episodes, I'm going to be doing them once a month. So I would love to hear if you have things that you're really hungry to learn about. Otherwise, I'm usually going to do something that's connected and woven into some of the bigger transits of the lunar cycle that we're working through. And it's just so fun to be able to change up this podcast, to change up this flow, and to really just follow like what feels good and fun for me. I really appreciate you. Again, if you're new, thanks for joining. Hope to have you back. If you've been here, please continue to come back. I'm so grateful to have you. I will see everybody next week for that Pisces total lunar eclipse, those rising sign horoscopes, and tarot card readings. Everybody, I am wishing you major change blessings, and I will see you next time.